Hello, and welcome to Cognitive Drift. When we talk about common sense, we aren't talking about complex philosophy or high-level academic theory. We are talking about the basic toolkit we all use to navigate reality. It is the set of mental heuristics that keeps us from drinking bleach, helps us look both ways before crossing the street, and prevents us from wiring our life savings to a stranger who claims to be a prince. We use this filter for everything. If a mechanic tells you your car needs a new engine because invisible gremlins ate the old one, you don't respect his belief. You find a new mechanic. If a doctor prescribes a medicine that has never passed a clinical trial and claims it works through magic vibrations, you walk out. In every single aspect of our lives, we demand evidence, consistency, and logical coherence. Except one. When it comes to religion, we represent a species that systematically turns off the common sense switch. We create a special carved-out exception where magic is treated as history, where contradictions are viewed as mysteries, and where the lack of evidence is praised as a virtue. But if we simply apply the same standard of testing that we use for buying a used car or choosing a mortgage, the entire structure of religious belief begins to crumble. Let's start with the most obvious test of all, the test of geography. If you were to wake up tomorrow with amnesia, having forgotten your name and your history, but you retained your ability to reason, you could look at a map of world religions and immediately spot a problem. If a scientific fact is true, it is true everywhere. Gravity works the same way in Brazil as it does in Iran. The boiling point of water doesn't change when you cross the border from India to Pakistan. Mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology are universal because they describe a reality that exists independently of human culture. But religion behaves exactly like culture. It behaves like language, or cuisine, or fashion. The single strongest predictor of which God you worship is not which religion makes the most logical sense, or which one has the best evidence. It is simply where your parents were living when you were born. If you were born in Arkansas, the odds are overwhelming that you believe Christianity is the one true path and that Islam is mistaken. If you were born in Riyadh, the odds are overwhelming that you believe Islam is the perfection of truth and Christianity is a corrupted text. Common sense asks a very simple question here. Is it really likely that the creator of the universe decided to reveal the ultimate truth of existence in a way that looks exactly like a cultural inheritance? Is it plausible that the eternal fate of your soul depends on the GPS coordinates of a delivery room? If there were one true religion, we would expect to see it appearing uniformly across the globe, independent of cultural transmission. We would expect people in isolated tribes in the Amazon to come out of the jungle carrying Bibles they had never seen, or reciting the Quran without ever meeting a missionary. But that never happens. Not once. The truth of religion always travels at the exact speed of human communication. It moves on trade routes, it spreads through conquest, and today, it travels via the internet. It behaves exactly like a virus or a meme, not like a fundamental truth of the cosmos. If you have to be told about a God to know he exists, that God is indistinguishable from a story. Let's move to the next test, the test of consistency. In our daily lives, we value internal logic. If a witness in a court trial says the suspect was tall, then says he was short, then says he was in two places at once, the jury throws out the testimony. We recognize that contradictions are the hallmark of falsehood. Yet religious texts are defined by their inability to keep a story straight. And we aren't even talking about the complex theological debates here. We are talking about basic narrative coherence. Depending on which page you read, the God of the major monotheistic traditions is described as all-loving, yet he orders genocide. He is described as all-knowing, yet he frequently tests people to see what they will do. If you know the future, you cannot be surprised, and you do not need to run tests. He is described as unchanging, yet he changes his mind constantly, bargaining with prophets and altering his rules based on the era. Common sense tells us that a perfect being cannot improve. If you are perfect, any change is a step down. Yet this character evolves from a tribal storm deity who prefers the smell of burnt meat into a cosmic abstraction of love. That isn't the revelation of a timeless truth. That is the evolution of a human character in a collection of books written over centuries. When we point this out, the defense is always that we are taking things out of context. But common sense has a reply to that, too. If you were an all-powerful being, capable of creating galaxies and DNA, and you wanted to leave a manual for your creation, a manual that was necessary to save them from eternal torture, would you write it in such a way that it required thousands of years of apologetics to explain why it doesn't mean what it clearly says? Would you allow your perfect word to be so ambiguous that it causes wars between people who both claim to be reading it correctly? Clear communication is the hallmark of intelligence. Ambiguity, contradiction, and confusion are the hallmarks of poor writing. Common sense suggests that if a god wrote a book, it would be the clearest, most undeniable text in existence. It would not look like a collection of Bronze Age poetry and folklore that gets things wrong about the shape of the earth, the source of disease, and the origin of species. And this leads us to the test of falsifiability. This is a cornerstone of critical thinking. For a claim to be meaningful, there must be a way to prove it wrong. If I tell you I have a dragon in my garage, you will ask to see it. If I tell you it's an invisible dragon, you will ask to touch it. If I tell you it's permeable, and you can't touch it, you will ask to measure its heat. If I tell you it's a heatless dragon, you eventually realize that there is no difference between an invisible, intangible, heatless dragon and no dragon at all. Religion survives by making sure its dragons are always invisible. It retreats into the gaps. This is what we call the God of the gaps. Thousands of years ago, almost everything was a god. Thunder was a god. The sun was a god. Disease was a demon. The tides were controlled by spirits. As we applied common sense and observation, what we now call science, we found physical explanations for these things. We found atmospheric pressure, nuclear fusion in the sun, bacteria and viruses, and the gravitational pull of the moon. And every time we found an answer, the God explanation had to retreat. God has never been found to be the answer to a mystery that was effectively solved. The answer has never once turned out to be magic. It has always turned out to be physics, or biology, or chemistry. So, common sense asks, if the explanation for the first 1,000 mysteries wasn't God, why do we assume the explanation for the next one will be? Today, the religious argument has retreated to the very edge of knowledge. They point to the Big Bang or the origin of life and say, "You can't explain that, so it must be God." But that is a logic failure. Admitting "we don't know yet" is honest. Inserting a magical entity because you are uncomfortable with not knowing is not honest, and it's not common sense. It is the exact same logic used by the ancient person who said, "I don't know why the ground is shaking, so the earth god must be angry." We can also look at the test of efficacy. This is perhaps the most practical common sense test of all. Does it work? If religious claims were true, we should be able to measure them. Take prayer. Millions of people pray every day for health, for safety, for recovery from illness. If we look at the data, does prayer work? We have done the studies. The largest, most rigorous studies on intercessory prayer show zero effect. Patients who are prayed for recover at the exact same rate as patients who are not prayed for. In fact, in some studies, Patients who knew they were being prayed for actually did slightly worse, likely due to what psychologists call performance anxiety, the stress of feeling like they had to get better because people were praying for them. If you had a car that only started when it was going to start anyway, you would say the key is broken. Prayer is a key that only turns the engine when the engine is already running. We see this same failure in the distribution of luck and tragedy. Common sense would suggest that if there were a benevolent superintendent of the universe who favored a specific group of people, those people would be statistically safer. They would have fewer cancer diagnoses. Their children would die less often in accidents. Their homes would be spared by tornadoes. But insurance companies, who rely entirely on cold, hard statistics to make money, do not ask you what religion you are. They don't give a discount to the faithful, because the data proves that nature does not care what you believe. A tornado will tear through a church just as easily as it tears through a liquor store. A virus will infect a saint just as quickly as it infects a sinner. The world looks exactly as it would look if there were no one steering the wheel. It looks random, indifferent, and governed by physical laws rather than moral ones. When a tragedy happens, religious thinking engages in post hoc rationalization. If the child survives the car crash, it is a miracle. If the child dies, it is God's will, or He works in mysterious ways. This is a rigged game. Heads I win, tails doesn't count. Common sense demands that we look at the misses as well as the hits. And when you count the misses, the miracles disappear into statistical noise. Then there is the psychological test. Why do we believe? If the evidence is so poor, why is religion so persistent? Here, common sense points us toward human psychology. We are pattern-seeking animals. If you are a primitive human on the savannah and you hear a rustle in the grass, it pays to assume it's a lion. If you are wrong, you just lose a little energy running away. If you are right, you save your life. We evolved to detect agency, to assume that when something happens, someone did it. We see faces in clouds, we hear voices in the wind, and we attribute intent to random events. Religion is a byproduct of this survival mechanism. It is the hyperactive firing of an ancient alarm system. We are uncomfortable with chaos, so we invent a manager. We are terrified of death, so we invent a sequel. We crave justice in an unfair world, so we invent a cosmic courtroom where everyone eventually gets what they deserve. These desires are understandable. They are deeply human. But wanting something to be true does not make it true. Common sense tells us that the universe is under no obligation to comfort us. The fact that the idea of heaven makes us feel better is actually a reason to be suspicious of it, not a reason to believe it. It is too convenient. It aligns too perfectly with our deepest fears and our most narcissistic desires: the desire to matter, the desire to live forever, the desire to be the protagonist of the story. Real truth is usually hard. It is usually complex and indifferent to our feelings. The story of religion is simply too human to be divine. Let's look at the moral test. One of the most common arguments is that without religion, we would have no moral compass, that common sense morality comes from God. But does this hold up to scrutiny? If you met a person who told you, "The only reason I don't murder people is because I'm afraid God will punish me," you wouldn't think that person was moral. You would think they were a psychopath on a leash. True morality, the kind that passes the common sense test, is based on empathy and the understanding of consequences. We don't kill because we understand that other people value their lives just as we value ours. We don't steal because we want to live in a society where our own things are safe. We have seen that secular societies often score higher on measures of societal health than highly religious ones. Look at Scandinavia or Japan. High rates of atheism, yet very low crime rates, high social trust, and strong social safety nets. Conversely, look at the prison population. Atheists are vastly underrepresented in prison compared to their percentage of the general population. If religion were the source of morality, prisons should be full of atheists. They aren't. Furthermore, religion often corrupts common sense morality. It can make good people do bad things by convincing them that a higher authority demands it. Common sense tells us that denying rights to people based on who they love is wrong. Common sense tells us that genital mutilation is wrong. Common sense tells us that forbidding contraception in regions ravaged by poverty and disease is wrong. Yet religion frequently demands these things. It short-circuits our natural empathy by placing dogma above human well-being. When you value the rules of an ancient text more than the suffering of a living human being standing in front of you, you have failed the moral test. You have sacrificed your humanity on the altar of a belief. Consider the complexity argument, often called the watchmaker analogy. People look at the human eye or the structure of a cell and say, "This is too complex to have happened by accident. It must have had a designer." It appeals to a certain kind of intuitive common sense, but it fails the test of deeper examination. First, complexity does not imply design. It implies process. We know the process. Natural selection explains how complexity arises from simplicity over billions of years without a designer. But even if we accepted the design argument, it leads to a common-sense disaster. If complexity requires a designer, then the designer, who is complex enough to design a universe, must also require a designer. And that designer needs a designer. You enter an infinite regress. Saying God always existed doesn't solve the problem. It just moves the mystery one step back. If God can exist without a creator, why can't the universe? Why add the extra step? Occam's razor is a principle of logic that says the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Adding an invisible, magical, complex, silent, undetectable superbeing to the equation doesn't explain anything. It just adds a massive layer of complexity that has no explanatory power. It is simpler to say, the universe exists, than to say, a God exists who created the universe. Let's also talk about the test of hiddenness. If you have a relationship with someone, a parent, a partner, a friend, that relationship is defined by interaction. You talk, you listen, you see them, you interact. If your father went out for cigarettes and never came back, but you insisted he was still a loving father who cared about you every day, people would say you are in denial. God is defined by his absence. He is the ultimate absentee father. We are told he wants a relationship with us, yet he refuses to manifest in any way that is distinguishable from his non-existence. We are told he loves us, yet he watches in silence while children die of leukemia, while tsunamis wipe out cities, while his own followers slaughter each other over how to interpret his silence. The common-sense interpretation of a silent, invisible, inactive party is that the party is not there. To maintain belief, you have to create a psychology of victimhood where you blame yourself for his silence. I didn't pray enough. I didn't have enough faith. I am not worthy. This is the language of an abusive relationship. It is the logic of a partner who says, "Look what you made me do," or, "If you were better, I wouldn't treat you this way." Healthy, real relationships are reciprocal. Religion is a one-way street where you pour your energy, time, and money into a void, and the void gives you back nothing but your own echo. We also need to look at the historical trend. The history of human knowledge is a history of religion losing territory. We used to need religion to explain the seasons. Then we found astronomy. We used to need religion to explain mental illness. Then we found neurology and psychology. We used to need religion to explain the diversity of life. Then we found evolution. Religion has never regained territory, it has lost. Science has never said, "You know what? We were wrong about germs. It actually is demons." The arrow of understanding only points one way. Common sense suggests that if a system of thought has been consistently wrong about the workings of reality for 5,000 years, we should probably stop treating it as an authority. It is an obsolete map. It was the best we could do when we were trying to figure out the world by candlelight. But we have satellites now. We don't need the mythology anymore. Finally, let's look at the concept of the soul and the afterlife from a common sense perspective. Everything we know about consciousness tells us that it is a product of the brain. If you damage the brain, you damage the mind. If you introduce chemicals like alcohol or anesthesia, you alter consciousness. If you destroy the brain, the consciousness stops. We see this in Alzheimer's patients, where the person slowly fades away as the physical structure of the brain deteriorates. Common sense tells us that the mind is what the brain does. It is not a ghost in the machine. It is the hum of the machine itself. The idea that the brain can die, decompose, and vanish, but the consciousness, your personality, your memories, your you-ness, will somehow float away and continue to exist is contrary to everything we observe in nature. It is like smashing a light bulb and expecting the light to keep shining somewhere else. The light is not a thing. It is a function of the bulb. When the bulb breaks, the light doesn't go to a light heaven. It just stops. This is a hard truth. It is a scary truth for many. But common sense requires us to face reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. The failure of religion is not a failure of intelligence on the part of believers. Some of the smartest people in history have been religious. The failure is a failure of application. It is the failure to apply the same rigorous, skeptical, practical common sense that we use for everything else to this one protected area of life. It is a blind spot. And once you decide to look at that blind spot, once you decide to shine the light of simple everyday logic into that corner, the illusion begins to fade. You realize that you don't need the magic. You don't need the invisible superintendent. You don't need the ancient books of rules. You have your own mind. You have your own empathy. You have the awe and wonder of a universe that is real, understandable, and magnificent enough without the need for fairy tales. This is just the beginning of the conversation. There are layers upon layers of dogma that peel away when you start scratching the surface. So, let's keep going. Let's look at what we might call the outsider test. This is a mental exercise that exposes the double standard we use for religious belief versus every other kind of belief. If I told you that in ancient Greece, people believed a god named Zeus threw lightning bolts from a mountain to punish people, you would nod and say, "Yes, that is an interesting mythology." You wouldn't lose any sleep wondering if Zeus is actually real. You wouldn't worry that you might be angering him by not sacrificing a goat. You recognize it immediately as a story invented by a pre-scientific culture to explain weather phenomena. We do this for Thor, for Ra, for Osiris, for Vishnu, for the thousands of gods that human beings have worshipped throughout history. We look at them with the clear, detached eye of common sense, and we see them as cultural artifacts. We see them as myths. But for the monotheist, there is one specific exception. They look at a list of thousands of dead gods and agree that they are all fiction. But then they get to their god, the one their parents told them about, and suddenly the critical thinking stops. Suddenly the magic becomes history. The local folklore becomes universal truth. The atheist is simply someone who goes one god further than the Christian or the Muslim. We just apply the same common sense to your God that you apply to all the others. If you understand why you dismiss the claims of Scientology or Mormonism, you understand why we dismiss the claims of Christianity or Islam. The evidence is exactly the same. It is hearsay, ancient texts, personal feelings, and a tight community reinforcing the belief. There is no qualitative difference between the miracles claimed by a modern guru in India and the miracles claimed in the New Testament. The only difference is familiarity and time. If a cult survives long enough, it becomes a religion. If a myth is repeated often enough, it becomes a fact. But common sense asks, is it really likely that out of the thousands of religions humanity has invented, 99.9% of them are silly superstitions, but exactly one of them, the one you happen to be born into, is the absolute truth? Or is it more likely that they are all products of the same human tendency to create stories? Let's dig into the texts themselves again, but this time, let's look at them through the lens of basic literacy and historical reliability. Most believers own a holy book. Very few actually read it cover to cover. They read the highlighted passages, the comforting verses on greeting cards, and the curated sections read from the pulpit. But if you actually sit down and read these books like you would read a contract or a history book, the divine nature evaporates. You don't find a consistent, transcendent voice. You find a collection of disjointed writings from different authors, writing in different centuries, with different political agendas. In the Bible, for example, you can see the seams where the stories were stitched together. You can see the evolution of the theology happening in real time. In the Old Testament, God is a physical being who walks in the garden, who wrestles with Jacob, who smells the aroma of burning fat. He is a tribal war deity who is jealous of other gods. Not, there are no other gods, but you shall have no other gods before me. Acknowledging that the other gods exist, but that this tribe is exclusive to this one. Then, centuries later, as Greek philosophy starts to influence the region, the concept of God shifts. He becomes abstract, non-physical, universal. Common sense tells us this is the evolution of literature, not the revelation of a static truth. And then there is the problem of transmission. We don't have the originals. We don't have the copies of the originals. We have copies of copies of copies, translated from oral traditions that were circulated for decades before anyone wrote them down. If you played the telephone game in kindergarten, you know what happens to a message after 3 or 4 people. Now imagine playing the telephone game over hundreds of years, across different languages, in a world without printing presses, where the scribes have a political motivation to alter the text. To believe that the book you hold in your hand today is the perfect, unaltered word of the Creator of the universe requires a suspension of common sense so massive it defies gravity. Scholars know this. We know about the verses that were added later. We know about the translation errors. We know that the story of the woman caught in adultery, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," doesn't appear in the earliest manuscripts. It was added by a scribe later because it was a good story. If this book is the instruction manual for the human soul, why did the manufacturer let it get so corrupted? Why didn't he just laser etch it onto the moon, or encode it in our DNA? Why rely on crumbling papyrus and fallible monks? Common sense says, he didn't. People wrote it. People edited it. People voted on which books to include and which to throw away at councils like Nicaea, based on the politics of the Roman Empire. It is a human project, from start to finish. Now, let's talk about the specific stories. The ones that, if we saw them in a movie, we would critique for bad writing. Take Noah's Ark. This story is often taught to children with cute paintings of giraffes sticking their heads out of a boat. But apply 5 minutes of adult common sense to it. We are talking about fitting millions of species on a wooden boat. Not just the animals, but the food for the animals for a year. And the fresh water. And the waste management. A zoo with a few hundred animals requires a staff of dozens and a massive budget just to keep the cages clean. We are supposed to believe that one family, in the Bronze Age, managed the sanitation for every species on Earth. And what about the plants? A global flood would kill all vegetation due to salinity and pressure. What about the freshwater fish that would die in the salt water, and the saltwater fish that would die in the fresh water mixture? What about the marsupials? Did the koalas walk from Australia to the Middle East to get on the boat, and then walk back, swimming across the ocean, without leaving a single fossil or trace of their journey anywhere in between? The physics, the biology, the geology, and the logistics make the story literally impossible. It is a myth. It is a retelling of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But religion asks you to look at this impossibility and say, it's true, because it says so. Common sense asks, how? And when the answer is magic, common sense checks out. Then there is the concept of hell. This is perhaps the most morally repulsive and logically bankrupt idea in the history of human thought. Let's look at it through the lens of justice. In our human legal systems, which are flawed but rational, we believe in the concept of proportionality. The punishment must fit the crime. If you steal a loaf of bread, we don't sentence you to be tortured for 50 years. If you murder someone, we might imprison you for life, but we don't torture you forever. Even the worst human criminal who commits the most heinous acts for a lifetime of 80 years has committed a finite crime. It happened in time. It had a beginning and an end. Hell is an infinite punishment for a finite crime. There is no math that makes that just infinite torture for the crime of what? Usually for the crime of not believing, for the crime of being born in the wrong culture, or finding the evidence unconvincing. Does common sense allow us to respect a judge who sentences a person to burn forever because they didn't stroke the judge's ego properly? We would call that judge a monster. We would call him a tyrant. Yet we are asked to call this God all-loving. Common sense spots the contradiction instantly. Love does not look like a dungeon. Perfect justice does not look like eternal torture. This is not the logic of a god. This is the logic of a cult leader. It is a fear tactic. It was invented to keep people in line. Do what I say, or something terrible will happen to you after you die, where no one can see it to disprove it. It is the ultimate or else. If a religion has to threaten you with eternal fire to keep you, it doesn't have a good argument. If the product was good, you wouldn't need to hold a gun to the customer's head. Now, let's examine the unity of religion. Believers often talk about the body of believers, or the ummah, as if it is a unified force. But look at the reality. Religion is the most fractured, divisive force on the planet. If there were truly a Holy Spirit guiding believers to the truth, shouldn't they agree on what the truth is? Christianity alone has roughly 45,000 different denominations. They disagree on everything. They disagree on how to get saved, how to baptize, whether Jesus is God or the Son of God, whether hell is real, whether gay people can be priests, whether women can speak in church. They have killed each other for centuries over these disagreements. Catholics killing Protestants, Sunnis killing Shias. Common sense asks, if all of these people are reading the same book and praying to the same God and getting different answers, what does that tell us about the source of the answers? It tells us the answers are coming from their own heads. They are projecting their own biases, their own politics, and their own fears onto a blank screen and calling it revelation. The confusion is the point. If there were a clear signal being broadcast from heaven, everyone with a receiver would hear the same message. The fact that everyone hears something different proves that there is no broadcast. There is only static, and we are hallucinating patterns in the noise. Let's pivot to the fine-tuning argument. This is a favorite of modern apologists. They say, look at the universe. The constants of physics are perfectly tuned for life. If gravity were slightly stronger or weaker, stars wouldn't form. Therefore, it must have been built for us. It sounds compelling until you hear the puddle analogy by Douglas Adams. Imagine a puddle waking up one morning and thinking, "This is an interesting world I find myself in. An interesting hole I find myself in. Fits me rather neatly, doesn't it? In fact, it fits me staggeringly well. Must have been made to have me in it." The puddle assumes the hole was designed for it. But common sense tells us the water changed shape to fit the hole. We were not designed for the universe. We evolved to fit the universe. If the universe were different, we wouldn't be here to complain about it. Maybe something else would be. Maybe nothing would be. But the fact that we are here is not evidence that the place was built for us. Furthermore, if the universe was built for life, it's a terribly designed one. 99.9999% of the universe is instantly lethal to us. The vacuum of space will kill you. The radiation will kill you. Most planets will freeze you or crush you. Even on Earth, for most of history, the environment has been trying to kill us with ice ages, volcanoes, predators, and disease. If this is a house built for humans, it's a house with no roof, toxic walls, and a floor made of lava, with one tiny corner where we can stand if we wear a coat. That is not intelligent design. That is a chaotic environment where we are barely scraping by. And what about the argument from personal experience? This is often the last refuge of the believer. I know it's true because I feel it in my heart. I had an experience. We must be respectful of people's feelings, but common sense tells us that feelings are not facts. The human brain is capable of generating incredibly powerful experiences. We can induce spiritual states with meditation, with fasting, with drumming, with chanting, and yes, with drugs. Neuroscientists can stimulate a specific part of the brain, the temporal lobe, and make you feel a presence in the room. They can make you feel one with the universe. These are biological states. And we know they aren't reliable indicators of truth because people in every religion have them. A Mormon has a burning in the bosom that tells him Joseph Smith was a prophet. A Pentecostal feels the Holy Spirit and speaks in tongues. A Muslim feels a profound peace while reciting the Quran. They cannot all be right. Their exclusive claims contradict each other, but they can all be wrong. Common sense says that if the same feeling confirms contradictory truths, then the feeling is not a lie detector. It's just a feeling. It confirms that you are human, that you have emotions, and that you are susceptible to group psychology and confirmation bias. It doesn't prove the theology. Finally, let's look at the indoctrination process. How does religion survive in a world of science and information? It survives by getting them while they are young. Common sense asks, if this truth is so self-evident, why do we need to teach it to toddlers? We don't need to organize Sunday schools to teach children that gravity is real. We don't need to sing songs to them to convince them that fire is hot. They figure those things out because they are true. But religion requires constant reinforcement. It requires creating a neural pathway before the child has the critical thinking skills to question it. If you took a group of children and raised them without ever mentioning religion, and then, when they were 20 years old, you presented them with the Bible and said, "Here, read this. It's all true," they would laugh. They would treat it like Grimm's fairy tales. Religion relies on bypassing the common sense filter before it has finished forming. That isn't education. That is conditioning. And recognizing that is the first step to breaking the cycle. When you step back and look at the whole picture, the geography, the history, the psychology, the science, the logic, the conclusion isn't that religion is a mysterious truth we can't quite grasp. The conclusion is that it is a very obvious, very human invention. It served a purpose once. It bound tribes together. It gave answers when we had none. But we have outgrown it. The training wheels were useful, but now they are just slowing us down. Let's talk about the very mechanism of belief itself. Faith. In religious circles, faith is treated as a virtue. It is praised as a higher form of knowing. But common sense tells us that faith is not a way of knowing things. Faith is what you use when you don't know things. If you have evidence, you don't need faith. I don't have faith that my car keys are in my pocket. I check, and I know. I don't have faith that penicillin cures infection. I have data. When someone says, I have faith, they are admitting, I don't have evidence, but I have decided to believe anyway. In any other context, we would call this gullibility. If a used car salesman told you, don't look under the hood, don't check the mileage, just have faith that this car runs perfectly, you would laugh in his face. You would recognize that he is trying to scam you. Common sense asks, why is this considered a virtue in religion? Why is the creator of the universe so impressed by people who believe things without good reason? If God gave us our brains, our logic, and our skepticism, why would he punish us for using them? Why would he reward the people who turn off their critical thinking and punish the people who ask for proof? It seems backward. A teacher loves a student who asks questions. A con artist hates a mark who asks questions. Which one does God sound like in this scenario? Now let's address the free will defense regarding evil. This is the standard response when we ask why a loving God allows suffering. He had to give us free will, and evil is the result of humans choosing poorly. On the surface, it sounds logical, but it fails the common sense test immediately when you look at natural disasters. When an earthquake buries a nursery school in rubble, whose free will was that? It wasn't the children's. It wasn't the teachers'. It wasn't a dictator's. It was the shifting of tectonic plates. When a mosquito bites a child and gives them malaria, that is not a consequence of human free will. That is biology. If God created the system, he created the tectonic plates, the cancer cells, and the malaria parasite. He created a world that is inherently dangerous and cruel. To blame that on human sin or free will is like a landlord building a house with faulty wiring that burns down, and then blaming the tenants for turning on the lights. Common sense says the architect is responsible for the building. Furthermore, let's look at the concept of heaven regarding free will. We are told heaven is a place of perfect happiness with no sin and no suffering. So common sense asks, do people in heaven have free will? If they have free will, can they choose to sin? If they can choose to sin, then heaven can become hell. It isn't safe. If they cannot choose to sin, then they don't have free will. So, if it's possible to create a world where beings have no free will, but are perfectly happy, heaven, why didn't God just create that world in the first place and skip all the suffering on earth? Or if it's possible to have free will and not sin, like God himself presumably does, why didn't he create us like that? The logic ties itself in knots. The only way to untangle it is to realize that these are stories invented by people who didn't understand plate tectonics or biology. They were trying to explain why bad things happen to good people, and we have free will was the best excuse they could come up with. Let's move to the slavery test. This is a brutal one. If the holy books are the source of objective morality, they should be ahead of their time. They should be better than the culture they were written in. But when we look at the Bible, or the Quran, we see clear, explicit instructions on how to buy, sell, and beat slaves. Not a condemnation of slavery, a regulation of it. Apologists will say, "Oh, but that was the context of the time. Slavery was different back then." Common sense rejects this. If you are the ultimate moral authority of the universe, you don't care about the context of the time. You set the standard. If God could say, "Don't eat shellfish and don't work on the Sabbath," he could certainly have said, "Don't own people." That is a very easy rule to write. Thou shalt not treat another human being as property. It's one sentence. It would have saved millions of lives and centuries of suffering. The fact that it isn't there tells us everything we need to know. It tells us that the book was written by men who owned slaves and wanted to justify it. It tells us that our modern, secular, common sense morality, which says slavery is abhorrent, is superior to the morality of the holy books. We have evolved past God, and if we can be more moral than God, he isn't a God worth worshipping. Consider the scale of the universe. When these religions were invented, we thought the earth was the center of everything. We thought the stars were just little lights on a dome, put there for us to look at. In that small box, it made sense to think that the Creator was obsessed with us. It made sense to think he cared what we ate, who we slept with, and what words we said. But now, common sense has to deal with the Hubble telescope. We know that we live on a tiny rock, orbiting a mediocre star, in the suburbs of a spiral galaxy that contains hundreds of billions of stars. And there are trillions of other galaxies. The scale is impossible to comprehend. To believe that the entity who created this expanse of space and time is legally concerned with whether you cover your hair or whether you eat meat on Fridays is the height of human arrogance. It is narcissism. It is like an ant in a colony in Africa, believing that the President of the United States is personally monitoring its daily routine. The scale doesn't fit. If a God exists who can spin galaxies, he is not the petty, jealous, rule-obsessed character we read about in Scripture. That character is too small. He is too human. He is a projection of our own ego. Let's look at the Pascal's wager argument. This is the gambler's argument. Even if you don't believe, you should act like you do, just in case. If you're wrong, you lose nothing. If you're right, you gain heaven. Common sense spots the flaws here instantly. First, which God do you bet on? If you bet on the Christian God, you might be angering Allah. If you bet on Allah, you might be angering Vishnu. You can't cover your bets. Secondly, and more importantly, can you trick an all-knowing God? If God is real, he knows you are just wagering. He knows you are faking it for fire insurance. Would a perfect being reward a dishonest gambler who is just trying to save his own skin? And would he punish an honest skeptic who searched for truth but couldn't find enough evidence? If God prefers the dishonest gambler over the honest thinker, he is corrupt. Common sense tells us that belief isn't a choice anyway. You can't force yourself to believe in Santa Claus again. You can't force yourself to believe gravity isn't real. You are either convinced or you aren't. Pretending to be convinced is just lying. And if God wants us to lie to him, that's a strange relationship. Let's touch on the comfort trap. A lot of people admit, well, it might not be logical, but it brings me comfort. It gives me community. It gives me hope. We have to acknowledge this. Religion does provide community. It provides a framework for grief. But common sense asks, is the only way to get these things to believe in a lie? We can have community without mythology. We have sports clubs, book clubs, charities, secular organizations. We can have wonder without superstition. We can look at the stars and feel awe without thinking a ghost put them there. We can have comfort in death without inventing a paradise. There is a profound comfort in the truth. The truth is that we are lucky to be here at all. The odds against your existence were astronomical, but you made it. You get to be the universe experiencing itself for a few decades. That is precious because it is finite. If you have an infinite amount of gold, gold is worthless. If you have an infinite amount of time, time is worthless. The fact that this is the only life we get makes every moment of it infinitely more valuable. Religious thinking devalues this life. It treats this world as a waiting room. It treats this life as a test. It tells you to suffer now, so you can be happy later. Common sense says, this is it. This is the main event. Don't waste it waiting for a sequel that was never filmed. Let's look at the financial model of religion. This is the follow the money test. If the church were purely a spiritual institution, why does it look so much like a corporation? Why does the Vatican have a bank? Why do televangelists fly in private jets? Why do religions fight so hard for tax-exempt status? If God is all-powerful, why does he always need money? He can create the universe from nothing, but he can't balance a checkbook. Common sense tells us that when an organization demands 10% of your income, promises you a product you can only see after you die, and threatens you with torture if you stop paying, that is a racket. It is the oldest subscription model in history, and it is brilliant, because the customer can never come back and ask for a refund. Let's also look at the geocentrism of Scripture. The holy books get the universe wrong. They talk about the firmament. They talk about the sun stopping in the sky. They talk about stars falling to earth like figs from a tree. If a star fell to earth, the earth would be vaporized before the star even got close. The writers didn't know what a star was. They thought it was a little light. When your divine text knows less about the universe than a fifth grader with a science textbook, common sense dictates that the text is not divine. It is exactly what it looks like, the folklore of people who didn't know where the sun went at night. Finally, let's consider the definition of God itself. Over the centuries, the definition has retreated. God used to be a man on a mountain. Then he was a spirit in the sky. Then he was outside of time and space. Now, sophisticated theologians describe him as the ground of all being, or pure actuality. They have defined him into an abstraction so vague that it means nothing. This is what happens when a hypothesis fails. You keep moving the goalposts. You keep diluting the definition until it is impossible to pin down. But a God who is indistinguishable from the laws of physics, or the concept of love, or the mystery of existence, is not a God. That's just poetry. We don't need to call the laws of physics God. We can just call them physics. Common sense prefers precision. If you say God, most people think of a thinking, acting being. If that being is gone, and all we have left is a vague feeling of something more, then let's be honest about that. Let's admit that the personal God, the one who answers prayers and writes books, is dead. So, where does this leave us? If we apply these tests, geography, consistency, morality, evidence, psychology, religion fails them all. It fails in the same way that alchemy failed. It fails in the same way that the geocentric model failed. It was a stepping stone. But holding on to it now is holding on to a deliberate ignorance. It is choosing to be a child when you have the capacity to be an adult. Leaving religion doesn't mean life becomes empty. It means the screen clears. The static is gone. You are no longer trying to reconcile impossible contradictions. You are no longer apologizing for a silent deity. You are no longer waiting for permission to be happy. You are free to define your own meaning. You are free to build your own morality based on real empathy, not fear. You are free to look at the universe with open eyes and see it for what it really is: vast, indifferent, beautiful, and yours to explore. Common sense is the candle in the dark. It flickers, but it is the only light we have. And it is enough. It is enough to guide us out of the cave and into the real world. The question is simply whether we are brave enough to blow out the torch of superstition and trust our own eyes. The world is waiting, and it is far more interesting than the myths we used to cover it up.